Welcome back, Focus Learners, to another explainer. Today we're diving straight into one of the absolute wildest political and military ascents in all of human history. We're going to map out exactly how a minor, pretty impoverished Corsican noble somehow leveraged the complete and utter chaos of his era to literally become the Emperor of France.
The East is where all great glory comes from. Now, that quote right there, straight from Napoleon himself, perfectly captures his relentless, opportunistic ambition. You see, for him, this wasn't just about serving the state. Oh no, it was deeply personal. He wanted to write himself into the history books, right alongside absolute legends like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar.
So, to wrap our heads around this monumental rise without getting totally bogged down in geopolitics, here's our agenda. We'll cover his unlikely origins, the chaos of the revolution, his brilliant Egyptian PR campaign, 19th century warfare, and finally, his crowning as emperor.
Part 1, an unlikely Corsican outsider. Because to really understand the emperor, we have to recognize just how far away he started from the actual center of French power.
Born in 1769 on the recently acquired island of Corsica, his family's collaborator status basically condemned him to a life of mediocrity in aristocratic France. So in the 1780s, he becomes an artillery officer. Which is actually kind of funny, because the aristocratic elites totally looked down on the artillery, mostly because it required actually knowing math and logistics. But imagine being just 24 years old today and pulling off a military masterstroke. Well, that's exactly what he does at the Siege of Toulon in 1793. A vital French port had been surrendered to the British and Royalist forces. Young Napoleon steps up, executes this brilliant artillery strategy to capture a surrounding fort, and makes the enemy fleet's position completely untenable. It works perfectly, and boom, he earns a promotion to brigadier general.
Moving on to Part 2, chaos, revolution, and opportunity. Napoleon definitely had tactical skills, but what he really needed was a massive structural upheaval to just clear out all those old aristocratic roadblocks. And, well, he got exactly that with the French Revolution.
The French monarchy was just entirely dysfunctional at this point. They were drowning in massive state debt from funding the American War of Independence, and the whole system was rigged so the rich paid virtually no taxes. So, when the whole structure finally collapsed in 1789, it opened up these profound societal chasms. You've got latent civil war, mass paranoia, and the rapid rise of radical Republican groups like the Jacobins. Essentially, it created a massive, gaping vacuum of power.
40,000. That is the staggering, horrific number of people put to death during the Jacobins' reign of terror. Just to put that into perspective, tying yourself to any political faction during this time was incredibly deadly, because regimes were rising and falling with terrifying speed.
Now, Napoleon had actually aligned himself with those radical Jacobins, so when they fell, his career was very nearly dragged down into the grave with them. But his path to redemption opened up a couple of years later, in 1795. A right-wing royalist uprising was suddenly threatening the new centrist government in Paris. They remembered Napoleon's artillery skills from Toulon, and they called him in. And Napoleon? He didn't hesitate for a second. He ruthlessly rolled his artillery right into the streets of Paris and fired grape shot, which is basically turning a cannon into a giant lethal shotgun, point blank into the massive crowd of royalist insurgents. This brutal, incredibly pragmatic use of violence ended the threat on the spot. It secured him the immense gratitude of the government and, more importantly, won him his first truly major command, the Army of Italy.
Section 3. The Egyptian PR campaign. After achieving immense success in Italy, where he acted almost like his own independent statesman, Napoleon pivots from being a domestic enforcer to an international conqueror and, quite frankly, an absolute master propagandist.
By 1798, the ongoing war against Britain was completely at a stalemate, so Napoleon looks east to the Levant. He's hoping to disrupt British trade routes to India, sure, but he also manages to persuade the government to send him to Egypt with a colossal military fleet, along with a genuinely remarkable scientific force. He brings hundreds of intellectuals, scholars, and scientists to map the region and catalog its monuments. In doing so, he basically founded the modern field of Egyptology along the way.
Look closely at the psychology behind his propaganda here. By intentionally mirroring classic Renaissance depictions of a Christ-like figure, Napoleon was cultivating a literal God complex. When his troops were struck by the plague in the Middle East, he notoriously had himself painted reaching out and fearlessly touching the sick victims. He wasn't just projecting himself as a general anymore.
He was framing himself as a messianic, personal savior to inspire absolute devotion from his men.
The myth that he carefully packaged and sent back to France was the story of a glorious, enlightening campaign where he deeply respected the local Islamic population and selflessly cared for his soldiers. But the reality on the ground? It was incredibly grim. The occupation was characterized by widespread theft, cynical religious manipulation, the highly controversial massacre of Ottoman prisoners, and ultimately a crushing military failure against the British Navy. And honestly, the most damning part of it all? When he finally realized the campaign was a stalemate, Napoleon literally abandoned his own army in Egypt so he could secretly sail back to France.
Part 4. 19th Century Warfare. Despite the reality, his propaganda worked flawlessly, and he returned to France viewed as a conquering hero. So let's actually unpack the mechanics of a war in the 19th century that allowed him to completely dominate Europe.
This iconic imagery showing a man's bond with his horse as he leads the charge perfectly encapsulates his incredibly hands-on, deeply admired command style. You see, Napoleon wasn't just a political manipulator sitting in a tent. He was the definitive battlefield commander of the early 19th century. He racked up more documented victories than any other commander in history, largely because he threw himself right into the friction and danger of combat alongside his men, and that is precisely why they loved him so much.
But his dominance definitely wasn't just luck. Napoleonic warfare was entirely defined by speed and geography. If you trace his campaigns on a map of France and its surrounding frontiers, what you're really looking at is a masterclass in spatial awareness. He constantly moved his troops way faster than anyone thought possible, consistently outmaneuvering numerically superior armies, like the Austrians. He would disperse his forces, take these massive tactical risks, and leverage aggressive cavalry commanders like Murat to completely sever enemy supply lines. A perfect example of this is when he pulled a page straight out of Hannibal's playbook. He marched his entire army right over the Alps just to catch the Austrians completely by surprise before the Battle of Marengo. He snatched a decisive, overwhelming victory straight from the jaws of defeat.
Which brings us to our final section, crowning an emperor. Because military success of this unbelievable magnitude, it eventually translates into absolute political dictatorship.
So remember how he abandoned his army in Egypt? Well, he arrived back in a Paris that was practically imploding. The ruling government, known as the Directory, was highly unstable and swinging wildly between political extremes. The politicians were actually actively looking for some military muscle to help them stage a coup and restore a bit of order. Napoleon steps in, but he very quickly hijacks the entire plot for himself. Now, he actually nearly ruined the whole coup with some incredibly terrible public speaking. I mean, his troops literally had to storm in and save him from his own botched speech, but they managed to violently clear out the legislators and dissolve the government by pure force.
To legitimize this brand new regime, he held a plebiscite, a public vote. The official result? 3 million yes votes. But here's the catch. His brother literally cooked the books. They didn't just want a simple majority. They wanted to manufacture the grand illusion of near-unanimous democratic consent from the French people to justify an authoritarian grip on the country. The new consular regime basically traded liberty for stability. And for many French citizens who were completely exhausted by a decade of bloody civil war, that seemed like a pretty fair trade at the time. He brought law and order, put a stop to the banditry and endless political vendettas. He centralized the judicial structure and codified the laws, a system that actually still heavily influences modern France today. He even smartly negotiated a concordat with the Catholic Church to put an end to years of religious conflicts. However, it is absolutely crucial to note that this return to a strictly patriarchal, conservative society meant a radical reduction of rights for others. Under Napoleon's new codes, women were stripped of virtually all their civil rights, essentially becoming the legal property of their fathers or husbands.
He certainly didn't stop at just seizing initial power. He walked a very deliberate, step-by-step path to dismantle the Republic entirely. First, making himself first consul. Then, after securing a brief pause to the endless wars with Britain and Austria, he leverages that massive popularity into yet another manipulated plebiscite to make himself consul for life. Finally, using the argument that a single assassin's bullet could unravel the entire state unless there was a permanent hereditary line of succession, he is proclaimed Emperor of the French.
This all culminates in December 1804. Napoleon knows his history. He knows that back in the year 800, Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope, which heavily implied that the emperor's power ultimately came from the church. Well, Napoleon wasn't having any of that. In a moment of supreme arrogance and frankly brilliant political theater, he literally takes the crown straight from the Pope's hands and crowns himself. He was making a crystal clear statement. His authority didn't come from God, and it certainly didn't come from the people. It came entirely from his own military conquests and his own two hands.
So, it leaves us with a massive question. Did Napoleon Bonaparte save the French Revolution by codifying its laws and exporting its ideals across Europe at the tip of a bayonet, or did he completely destroy it by dismantling the Republic, stripping away civil rights, and crowning himself an absolute dictator? It is an incredibly complex legacy of a man whose institutions and absolute thirst for glory quite literally shaped the modern world as we know it. Thank you so much for joining me on this Explainer Focused Learners, and I will see you in the next one.